Varek Dominion had not lost a war in 4,000 years. This was not a boast. It was simply a fact, catalogued in the Dominion's central archives with the same clinical detachment that the Varek applied to all facts: the atmospheric composition of conquered worlds, the biological taxonomy of absorbed species, the precise date and standard time at which each civilization had formally surrendered its sovereignty and accepted integration into the Dominion's vast, cold hierarchy. The archives were meticulous. The Varek were meticulous. It was perhaps the defining characteristic of their civilization, this absolute commitment to order, to precision, to the understanding that the universe was a system to be categorized and controlled, rather than a mystery to be wondered at. Supreme Executor, Sareth Kal stood on the command bridge of the Eternal Precedent and looked out at the stars with the quiet confidence of a being who had never, in his 312 years of life, encountered a problem that the Dominion's hierarchy could not solve. He was tall even by Varek standards, his scales the deep amber of old authority, darkened at the ridgelines of his jaw and brow by the pigmentation that came only with age and rank. His eyes were the color of cold iron, vertical pupils that missed nothing, and when he moved with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a predator who had not needed to rush toward prey in longer than most species had possessed written language. The Eternal Precedent was a Dominion sovereign-class vessel, 11 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull plated in the black-green composite alloy that the Varek had perfected over millennia of continuous naval engineering. Around it, the 7th Deliberation Fleet spread across 200,000 kilometers of space, like a constellation of cold, perfect power. 430 warships, from the vast Sovereign-class flagships to the smaller but devastatingly efficient Fang-class strike, vessels that swarmed at the fleet's edges like scaled fingers, flexing before a fist closed. The Varek had not assembled the 7th Deliberation Fleet because they were afraid. They had assembled it because the protocols demanded it. When a new species was encountered at the boundary of Dominion-claimed space, the protocols were clear. Send the Deliberation Fleet, make contact, offer integration. If integration was refused, demonstrate the consequence of refusal. The protocols had been written 4,000 years ago by minds far greater than Sareth Kal's, and they had worked 4,000 years ago, and they had worked every time since, and so they would work now. He had read the survey reports on the humans 3 times, which was 2 more times than he normally bothered. The reports had not warranted 3 readings from a strategic standpoint. They had warranted 3 readings purely from a taxonomic curiosity, the kind of detached interest a naturalist might feel upon discovering an unusual insect. Humans were, by any measurable Dominion metric, a Category 3 emergent species, barely a century into meaningful spaceflight. A single homeworld, a handful of fragile orbital stations, and 1 colony, 1E, established on a marginally habitable world they had named Callum's Rest, approximately 40 light-years from their home system. Their ships were primitive to a degree that had prompted the survey team's lead taxonomist to include an apologetic footnote in his report, as though embarrassed on the humans' behalf. Chemical-assisted fusion drives, railgun armaments, point defense systems that the Varek had surpassed before the humans' ancestors had discovered agriculture. They were divided, these humans. Their political structure was a bewildering mosaic of competing nation-states, loose federations, corporate entities, and something called the Terran Cooperative Authority, which appeared to be the closest approximation to a unified government they had managed to produce. Even that was fractured. 3 of the most powerful human political blocs had refused to contribute ships or resources to the Cooperative Authority's nascent space navy. The humans were, in the most technical sense, not even fully at war with each other, but they were very far from being at peace. Sareth Kal had found this deeply unsurprising. Category 3 species were almost always divided. It was one of the reasons they were Category 3. The capacity for unified hierarchical purpose was what separated species that endured from species that were absorbed. The Dominion had learned this lesson so thoroughly that the lesson itself was ancient. When the Eternal Precedent dropped out of superluminal transit at the edge of the human system's outer boundary, Sareth Kal gave the order for standard contact protocols with the measured tone of a being performing a bureaucratic formality. The translation matrices had already processed the humans' primary communication languages. There were an astonishing 47 of them, and the diplomatic transmission was composed and ready. It was the same transmission the Dominion had sent to 63 other species across 40 centuries. It had never required a follow-up. The response came in 11 minutes. The delay itself was informative. 11 minutes suggested the humans had no relay station at the system boundary, that the signal had traveled at the speed of light to wherever their nearest communication hub was, and that someone had needed to make a decision about how to respond. The response itself was brief. It was transmitted in the human lingua franca they called Standard Terran, and when the translation matrix rendered it, Sareth Kal read it twice before setting it down with the careful deliberateness of a being controlling an expression. The humans had said no. Not the elaborate, fearful, negotiated no of a species trying to buy time. Not the aggressive, posturing no of a species that didn't understand what it was refusing. Just no. A 3-paragraph transmission from something called the Terran Cooperative Authority's Office of External Relations, politely but unambiguously declining the Dominion's offer of integration, expressing what it described as deep respect for the Varek, Dominion's long history, and noting that humanity wished to pursue its own developmental path and hoped that a relationship of mutual non-interference and eventual partnership might be possible. Partnership. The word had taken the translation matrix a moment to render correctly, because there was no precise Varek equivalent. The closest analog in the Dominion's linguistic database was a term that roughly meant temporary alliance between equals, and it was a term that existed primarily in historical archives describing arrangements between Dominion great houses, not between the Dominion and a species that had possessed spaceflight for less time than some Varek individuals had been alive. Sareth Kal had set the transmission down, looked out at the stars, and felt the particular cold clarity of a decision that had already been made for him by 4,000 years of precedent. He gave the order to advance. On Callum's Rest, Administrator Yeva Marchetti was standing in the middle of the colony's main communications center when the alert came through. And the first thing she felt was not fear, but a specific, exhausted kind of grief. The grief of someone who had been waiting for bad news long enough that when it arrived, it felt less like a shock and more like a confirmation. Callum's Rest was not a beautiful world. It was functional, the kind of world that humanity, in its early and optimistic spacefaring years, had classified as marginally habitable and then sent colonists to anyway because it was there and because the Terran Cooperative Authority had needed to demonstrate that humanity could establish a permanent presence beyond the solar system. The atmosphere was breathable but thin at altitude. The native vegetation was gray-green and low to the ground, as though the planet itself had decided that ambition was inadvisable. The colony numbered 47,000 people, most of them engineers, agricultural technicians, scientists, and the families they had brought with them, all of them living in the habitat domes that clustered around the original landing site like a handful of soap bubbles someone had forgotten to pop. Yeva had been administrator for 6 years, appointed by the TCA over 3 other candidates, partly because of her administrative record, and partly, she suspected, because she was the only one of the 4 who had actually visited Callum's Rest before applying for the post. She was 53 years old, with the kind of face that had been weathered by responsibility rather than sun, and she had spent 6 years making this colony work against bureaucratic indifference, supply chain failures, and a political situation back on Earth that had slowly gone from complicated to dire. The Varek had been detected 4 months ago, when the TCA's long-range sensor network, built mostly from repurposed commercial astronomy hardware because the military budget had collapsed in the previous fiscal session, had picked up superluminal transit signatures at the edge of the solar system. The TCA had sent its response. The Varek had sent their fleet. And for 4 months, Yeva had been watching the Varek 7th Deliberation Fleet move through human space, with the unhurried confidence of something that knew it did not need to hurry. While back on Earth, the political situation had done what the political situation always did when confronted with an existential threat that required unified action. It had fragmented. The North Atlantic Alliance had declared that the TCA did not have the authority to commit Alliance citizens to a military response without a full parliamentary vote, which would take 6 months minimum. The Pacific Rim Consortium had announced that it was pursuing its own diplomatic channel with the Varek and would not be subordinating its independent foreign policy to the TCA's framework. The Eurasian Federation had done nothing at all, which was somehow worse than both of the alternatives. The TCA's Secretary General, a man named Paulo Delgado, who Yeva had met once and found to be genuinely competent in a situation that was rapidly exceeding the competence of any individual, had managed to authorize the deployment of the Terran Cooperative Navy, all 31 ships of it, to a defensive position between the Varek fleet and the inner solar system. 31 ships. Against 430, Yeva had not been afraid when she'd read that number. She'd been angry. The anger was still there 4 months later, sitting in her chest like a stone she'd learned to breathe around. Then, 2 weeks ago, the thing that she had feared more than the Varek had happened. The TCA Council had voted. Not to fight. Not to negotiate from strength. They had voted in an emergency session that Yeva had watched via delayed transmission with her hands flat on her desk, to offer the Varek a compromise. They would surrender Callum's Rest, designated a Varek-administered territory, remove human personnel. In exchange, they hoped, the word had been used 3 times in the resolution, that the Varek would recognize Earth's solar system as sovereign human space and pursue no further territorial claims. They had not asked Yeva. They had not asked the 47,000 people on Callum's Rest. They had simply transmitted their decision to the Varek diplomatic channel and then sent Yeva the official notification, classified Priority 1, with a 48-hour evacuation window. She had read the notification. She had set it down. She had walked to the viewport in her office and looked out at the gray-green landscape of Callum's Rest for a long time. Then she had sent a single encrypted message to an address that was not in any TCA database, using an encryption key that had been given to her 18 months ago by a man named Admiral Kovacs, who had told her, when he gave it to her, that she would know when to use it. She used it. Admiral Kovacs received Yeva's message in the operations center of the TCN vessel, Unwavering, which was the flagship of a fleet that, officially, no longer existed. The 31 ships of the Terran Cooperative Navy had been deployed to a defensive position 4 months ago. 22 of them were still there, maintaining a visible presence between the Varek fleet and Earth's solar system, their sensor signatures broadcasting loudly enough that the Varek could not miss them. The other 9 ships, the Unwavering, the Patient Stone, the Long Calculation, the Borrowed Time, the Cassidy, the Equimi, the Threshold, the Debt Collector, and the Last Formal Argument, had gone dark 6 weeks ago. Not destroyed, dark. Running on minimal power, engines cold, broadcasting nothing, positioned in the debris field of a shattered asteroid belt 17 light minutes from the main engagement corridor, wrapped in reflective baffling that had been designed by a team of engineers at the University of Cape Town, working from a theoretical paper published 2 years earlier about how to make a spacecraft electromagnetically invisible. The paper had been theoretical. Kovacs had made it practical at considerable expense, on a budget that he had described in his requisition forms as sensor, calibration equipment, because the TCA's finance committee would have approved that and would not have approved what it actually was. Kovacs was 61 years old, a compact man with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned, over a very long career, that the most dangerous moments in any situation were the ones that felt like they were over. He had served in the TCN for 37 years, beginning as a junior navigation officer on a commercial military hybrid vessel during the asteroid mining disputes of the 2140s. And he had spent most of those 37 years being underfunded, politically sidelined, and intermittently told by various civilian authorities that his strategic assessments were alarmist. He had been right every time. This had not made him popular. 18 months ago, when the first Varek transit signatures had been detected, not by the official long-range network which had missed them, but by a private astronomer in rural New Zealand whose equipment was better than the TCA's because she'd built it herself. Kovacs had gone to the TCA Council with a briefing that he had spent 6 weeks preparing. It was the most thorough strategic document he had ever produced. It contained full analysis of the sensor data, extrapolated Varek capabilities based on drive signature physics, probability matrices for their political response to first contact, and a proposed defensive strategy that he had titled, with the dry precision that was his signature, Protocols for Engagement with a Technologically Superior Adversary in the Context of Human Territorial Defense. The Council had thanked him. They had asked for a summary version. The full document was 400 pages, and when he had produced a 12-page summary, they had thanked him again and told him that the diplomatic track was the priority, and that military preparations would be considered in the context of ongoing negotiations. Kovacs had gone back to his office, closed the door and begun implementing the plan anyway. Not all of it. Not the parts that required council authorization, but the parts that were within his operational discretion as Fleet Admiral, the baffling technology, the dark fleet positioning, the weapons program that he had authorized under a maintenance budget line that technically covered propulsion system upgrades. The weapons program was the important part. It had taken 14 months. It had involved 12 engineers, 3 physicists, 1 materials scientist named Dr. Amara Ose, who had left a tenured position at MIT to work on it, because Kovacs had explained the situation to her honestly, and she had looked at him and said, "When do I start?" The weapon was not elegant. The Varek would have found it crude, probably. It used principles they had known for centuries. But it used those principles in a configuration that required something the Varek did not have, and had not needed for 4,000 years, which was the specific ingenuity that comes from being desperate, underfunded, and entirely unwilling to accept the logical conclusion that you cannot win. When Yeva's message arrived, Kovacs read it once, set it down, and turned to his operations officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Commander Priya Anand, who had been with the Dark Fleet since the beginning, and who had the particular look in her eyes of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment for a very long time and could see it. Approaching, send the signal to the other. 8, Kovacs said. We're live. The Varek assault on Callum's Rest began at 0340 Colony Standard Time, 6 hours after the TCA Council's surrender offer was formally received and acknowledged by the Varek diplomatic channel. Sareth Cal had read the surrender offer with the expression of someone confirming a calculation they had already made.
He had acknowledged it.
He had also ordered the assault because the surrender of Callum's Rest was now a formality, and the Varek did not wait for formalities to be completed before executing the operational logic that the formalities described. The colony would be cleared. The human infrastructure would be assessed. What was useful would be repurposed. What was not would be removed. This was integration. This was how it had always worked. The Fang-class strike vessels hit the colony's orbital defense platforms first, 3 small automated stations that the TCA had deployed before the budget collapsed, armed with railguns and a modest magazine of surface-to-orbit missiles. The platforms fought back. They were not expected to fight back well, and they did not fight back well. But they fought back with a consistency and a refusal to power down that Sareth Cal noted with mild interest. The automated systems kept firing until they were physically destroyed, not until they were outgunned, which was slightly different and slightly unusual, and he filed the observation away with the same instinct that had kept him alive and effective for 3 centuries. The instinct that said, a thing that seems trivial is only trivial until it isn't. The orbital platforms were destroyed in 40 minutes. The Varek assault shuttles descended. On the colony surface, the evacuation that the TCA had ordered was 40 hours from completion. There were not enough ships to move 47,000 people in 48 hours, a logistics failure that Yeva had flagged in her response to the evacuation order, and that the TCA had acknowledged and then said nothing useful about. There were approximately 19,000 people still on Callum's Rest when the Varek shuttles landed, the rest having been lifted out on the first wave of evacuation vessels. What happened next was not a battle. The humans on the surface had no weapons capable of meaningfully engaging Varek ground forces. Yeva had ordered full compliance, no resistance, no confrontation. The remaining colonists gathered in the central habitat domes and waited, and the Varek soldiers moved through the colony with efficient, methodical contempt, cataloging everything, interfering with nothing that wasn't a weapon system, and treating the humans they encountered with the specific brand of indifference that is somehow worse than hostility, because it contains no acknowledgement of consequence. Yeva stood in the communications center and watched through the dome viewport as a Varek ground commander directed his soldiers through the agricultural sector with a pointing gesture. And she thought about the 6 years she had spent building this place, and she thought about the 47,000 people who had trusted her to keep it running, and she felt the grief and the anger compress inside her into something harder and quieter and more durable than either. She looked at the encrypted communication unit on her desk. The light on it was green. Kovacs had received her message. The plan was live. She allowed herself very briefly the luxury of hoping. The 22 TCN ships that the Varek could see had behaved throughout the crisis, exactly as the Varek expected a small and outmatched navy to behave. They had taken up a defensive position. They had not advanced. They had transmitted increasingly desperate-sounding communications to Earth as the diplomatic situation deteriorated. When the TCA Council's surrender offer was transmitted, the visible fleet had gone to minimal power, a posture that the Varek tactical analysis interpreted as demoralized standing down, consistent with a military that had been told by its civilian government that the fight was over. 3 of the 22 ships had been badly damaged in a brief engagement 2 weeks earlier, when a Varek Fang squadron had probed the human defensive line and the humans had fought back harder than expected, which had briefly interested Sareth Kal before the tactical picture resolved into something familiar. The 3 damaged ships were broadcasting clear distress signals. Their power readings were consistent with severe system damage. One of them, a vessel the humans called the Terra Firma, appeared to be entirely without propulsion, drifting on a slow arc that would take it out of the engagement corridor and into the debris field of the asteroid belt to the system's ecliptic north. A second damaged ship, the Covenant Ridge, was attempting to escort it. The third, the Shackleton, was maintaining a holding position near the defensive line. Its weapon systems apparently still functional, but its drive clearly compromised. Sareth Kal had looked at the 3 damaged ships and seen exactly what they appeared to be. The battlefield dead. Disabled. Harmless. The equivalent of the wounded animal at the edge of the herd, already removed from the equation of the living. He had not looked at them again. Dr. Amara Osei had not slept in 31 hours, and she was sitting in the weapons bay of the Unwavering, with a cup of cold coffee and a tablet displaying 14 months of calculations that were about to be tested for the first time in an operational context. And she was very deliberately not thinking about what would happen if the calculations were wrong. The weapon she had built, that she and her team of 12 engineers had built, in the cramped and inadequately lit machine spaces of 9 TCN warships running on skeleton crews and minimum power, was not a beam weapon. The Varek had beam weapons that were centuries beyond anything humanity could produce. It was not a missile system. The Varek's point defense would handle missiles with contemptuous efficiency. It was not a kinetic impactor. The Varek's shield technology, while not perfectly understood by human physicists, was clearly capable of handling kinetic threats. It was a resonance disruptor. And the reason it would work, the reason it had to work, was based on something that Kovacs had noticed in the very first sensor scans of the Varek fleet, something that the TCA's military analysts had categorized as a propulsion signature characteristic and moved past without dwelling on, but that Kovacs had taken to Osei and said, "Tell me what this means." And Osei had looked at it for 6 hours straight and then said, "It means their shields generate a harmonic, and harmonics have a frequency, and frequencies can be matched." The Varek's shield technology was ancient. It had been developed 4,000 years ago and refined continuously since, and it was extraordinarily effective against every threat the Varek had encountered in 4,000 years of continuous warfare. Because every threat in 4,000 years of Varek warfare had been a species that either possessed similar or inferior technology and had tried to defeat the Varek by being better at the things the Varek were already best at. No one had tried to beat the shield by listening to it. The resonance disruptors required precise frequency matching. They required continuous recalibration as the target shield fluctuated. They required processing power that had taken 3 of Osei's engineers 4 months to figure out how to fit inside a ship that was not supposed to have a weapon system at all. And they required something else. They required the disruptor to be physically close to the target, within 3,000 kilometers, because the resonance effect degraded rapidly over distance, which meant that the 9 dark ships needed to survive long enough to get close, which was the part of the plan that Kovacs had presented to his senior staff with characteristic directness. This is where it gets difficult. The key insight, the thing that Kovacs had understood and no one else had quite articulated, was that the Varek fleet's greatest strength was also the premise of its greatest vulnerability. They were arrogant, not stupidly arrogant. Sareth Kal was clearly not a stupid being, but arrogant in the specific way that 4,000 years of unbroken victory produces, which is the arrogance of a being who has learned that the universe confirms their assumptions, and who has therefore stopped testing those assumptions against new data. They had looked at 3 damaged, drifting human ships and seen defeated hardware. They had not looked again. They had not scanned them for weapon signatures because damaged ships that were drifting with no propulsion did not have weapon signatures. They had not tracked their trajectories with tactical attention because the trajectories of the defeated are irrelevant. They had not noticed when the 3 damaged ships' slow drifts, completely consistent with the physics of unpowered vessels in a gravitational system, had carried them over the course of 2 weeks to positions that placed them within 3,000 kilometers of 3 different Varek capital ships. They had not noticed because they had not looked. And they had not looked because they had already decided. The Terra Firma, the Covenant Ridge, and the Shackleton were not disabled. They were not drifting. Their drives were powered down to below the threshold of Varek passive sensors, and their crews, reduced to 6 people each, everyone else evacuated to maintain cover, had been lying in the dark for 2 weeks breathing carefully rationed air, eating cold rations, and waiting for a green light that now, finally, was being transmitted from the Unwavering in the asteroid belt. Sareth Kal was reviewing the Callum's Rest Integration Report when the alert came. Not a tactical alert. The tactical systems showed nothing unusual. A sensor anomaly. One of the Fang Squadron commanders had flagged it. An unusual power reading from one of the drifting human derelicts. Small. Possibly an automated system cycling on. The Fang commander had filed it as a notation rather than an alert because the protocols described derelict human vessels as non-threats, and the protocols were the protocols. Sareth Kal read the notation. He set it down. He picked it up again. He was reaching for the ship-wide alert control when the Eternal Precedent shuddered. It was not the shudder of an impact. The Eternal Precedent's shields would have handled an impact. It was something else. A vibration that seemed to come from the shields themselves. A resonant shaking, as though the field that surrounded the ship had suddenly become discordant with itself. The shield indicators on every console on the bridge shifted from green to amber, to a color that Sareth Kal had never seen on a shield indicator in 312 years of service. A color that had no tactical designation because no tactical designation had ever been needed for it. The shields were failing. Not from penetrating damage, from within. Across the engagement corridor, the same thing was happening to 2 other Varek capital ships simultaneously. On the Fang Squadron tactical net, the confusion was immediate and total. Ships trying to report anomalies that didn't correspond to any weapon in the Varek threat database. Commanders asking questions that the tactical AI couldn't answer. The precise, hierarchical command structure of the 7th Deliberation Fleet, encountering something it had never had to process before, which was a situation the protocols had not anticipated. The Terra Firma, powered up with a surge that lit every sensor panel in the Varek fleet simultaneously, its drive igniting at full military thrust from a dead stop 300 kilometers off the Eternal Precedent's port quarter, and Sareth Kal had exactly 4 seconds to understand what he was looking at before the Terra Firma fired its resonance disruptor at point-blank range and the Eternal Precedent's shields collapsed entirely. In the asteroid belt, the Unwavering powered up. The Patient Stone. The Long Calculation. The Borrowed Time. The Cassidy. The Equeme. The Threshold. The Debt Collector. The Last Formal Argument. 9 ships coming alive simultaneously from the dark. Drives at full military power, weapons hot. Accelerating toward the now unshielded flanks of a Varek fleet that was, for the first time in 4,000 years, experiencing something its commanders had no protocol for. Surprise. The 22 visible TCN ships, which had been sitting at minimal power in their defensive posture, came alive at the same moment, and every one of them that had a functional weapon system opened fire on a designated Varek target. Targets that had been assigned 2 weeks ago, while the dark ships were drifting and the fleet was waiting, while Kovacs and his tactical team had sat in the dark and done the one thing they were best at, which was think. The Varek 7th Deliberation Fleet fought back. It would be false and dishonest to suggest otherwise. They were not fools, and they were not cowards, and 3 centuries of combat command had given Sareth Kal instincts that functioned even in situations his experience had never covered. He got his unshielded capital ships moving within seconds of the collapse, using mass and momentum and the overlapping point defense of adjacent ships to compensate for the lost shields. He reformed the fleet into a defensive configuration that was not in the protocols because the protocols didn't contain defensive configurations. The Varek had never needed them, but that was geometrically sound and intuitively correct. He targeted the 9 dark ships with everything available, understanding with cold clarity that the resonance disruptors were the threat that had to be eliminated first. He destroyed 2 of the 9. The Cassidy and the Borrowed Time were hit by concentrated fire from 3 Varek cruisers within the first 4 minutes of the engagement, their baffling stripped away and their hulls breached and their crews. Kovacs would not learn their names until afterward. All 12 of them, 6 from each ship, did not survive. It was a cost that Kovacs had anticipated and budgeted for, and that sat in him like a wound that wouldn't close. Even as the tactical picture continued to develop in the direction his plan required, the 7 remaining dark ships pressed forward. They fired. They recalibrated. They fired again. OC's resonance disruptors worked differently on different classes of Varek vessel, more effective against the capital ships with their older, more resonant shield matrices, less effective against the newer Fang-class vessels, whose shields were of a different generation and required different frequency targeting. But less effective was not ineffective, and 7 ships firing in coordinated salvos at a fleet that was trying to reform its command structure while simultaneously processing a tactical situation it had never encountered produced results that compounded with every minute that passed. The Varek Sovereign-class ship, voice of precedent, lost shields entirely to a sustained resonance barrage from the Equami and the Threshold, and was destroyed by combined fire from 4 TCN vessels 12 minutes into the engagement. The loss of a Sovereign-class ship produced a disruption in the Varek tactical net that cascaded through the hierarchical command structure in ways that the structure had never been tested against. Because the structure was designed for the certainty of Varek dominance, and certainty, it turned out, was load-bearing in a way that no one had fully stress-tested. Sareth Kal watched his fleet struggle with the honesty of a being who had, in those first 4 seconds of understanding, comprehended the full scope of what had been done to him. He had been deceived, not simply surprised, deceived. Deceived over weeks through patience and calculation, and an absolute commitment to a plan that required its architects to trust that the enemy would do exactly what arrogance predicted they would do. He had looked at the drifting human ships and seen the defeated, and in seeing the defeated he had abdicated the most fundamental responsibility of a commander, which was to keep looking. He fought. He regrouped. He extracted what he could. The 7th Deliberation Fleet, which had arrived in human space as a demonstration of unquestionable force, withdrew from the engagement corridor after 38 minutes with 112 ships destroyed or disabled, and the remainder damaged to varying degrees, trailing the wreckage of its assumptions toward the superluminal transit point with a speed that the Varek military hierarchy would never, in any official record, describe as retreat, but which was retreat. The TCN lost 9 ships total. The Cassidy, the Borrowed Time, and 7 others caught in the fiercest part of the fighting. The crews of those 9 ships, 411 people barn, were gone. Kovacs sat with that number for a long time, after the tactical situation resolved. Sareth Kal's official report to the Varek Supreme Council was the most difficult document he had, composed in 3 centuries of service. Not because the facts were complicated. The facts were simple and devastating. A Category 3 emergent species assessed as non-threatening had demonstrated a capacity for strategic deception that had not been observed in a non-Dominion species since the 3rd millennium of Varek expansion. They had used their own apparent defeat as a weapon. They had used the Dominion's protocols, the very protocols that had made the Dominion's expansion so efficient, against the fleet, because the protocols assumed an adversary who responded to overwhelming force with the logic of survival, not with the logic of a longer game. He did not minimize his error. Sareth Kal was a being of rigid hierarchy, and the hierarchy demanded honesty in failure as much as it demanded precision in victory. He wrote that he had classified the human derelicts as non-threats without secondary verification. He wrote that the failure was his. He wrote a recommendation, the first such recommendation he had filed in his career, that the Dominion's threat assessment protocols for Category 3 species be revised to account for strategic deception capacity, and that the Dominion should not assume that a species' apparent level of technological development reflected the full scope of their strategic capability. He also wrote, in a final paragraph that he considered carefully for 3 days before including, that the humans had offered terms, that after the 7th Deliberation Fleet had withdrawn, the Terran Cooperative Authority had transmitted a formal communication to the Varek diplomatic channel. The communication had not demanded tribute. It had not made territorial claims on Varek space. It had said that humanity understood that the Varek Dominion was a civilization of great age and achievement, that this engagement had been a defensive action and not an act of aggression, and that humanity hoped, in the word appearing again, that word with no Varek equivalent, that both civilizations could find a path toward the coexistence and eventual partnership that had been proposed at first. Contact. Sareth Kal included this paragraph because the hierarchy demanded complete reporting, and because something in the transmission had sat with him in a way he couldn't categorize, which was unusual for a being who had spent 3 centuries categorizing things. The humans had won. They had won convincingly. They had engineered with patience and ingenuity, and a willingness to suffer losses in service of a larger plan, the defeat of a fleet that should have been, by every measurable standard, undefeatable. And then they had offered the hand they were not required to offer, to an enemy who had stripped their only colony and killed their civilian sense of security, and arrived in their system with the explicit intention of ending their independence. He did not fully understand it. He included it in the report because things that could not be fully understood were worth documenting. Yeva Marchetti stood on the surface of Callum's Rest 6 weeks after the Varek withdrew, watching the first of the returning colonists step out of the transport shuttle and onto the gray-green ground, and she felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief and not quite grief, but contained all three in a proportion she couldn't quite calculate. The colony was intact. The Varek had not destroyed it. They had been efficient but not destructive during the occupation, and the infrastructure had survived largely undamaged, which was probably a testament to Varek discipline rather than Varek mercy. But the result was the same regardless of the motivation. Callum's Rest was still standing. The 47,000 people who had called it home were coming back to it. She had spoken with Kovacs twice since the battle. He was not a man who processed events at the speed that politicians or journalists did. He processed them at the speed of a person who wanted to understand them correctly before speaking about them. He had told her in their second conversation that the 9 lost ships were a weight he would carry for the rest of his life, and that he would not insult the people on those ships by pretending the weight was anything other than what it was. She had told him that they hadn't lost. He had said with the precision that was his nature, that they had won, and that those were different things, and that both were true at the same time. She watched the colonists come home and thought about the 14 months of preparation, the dark ships waiting in the asteroid belt, the 12 engineers and 3 physicists and 1 extraordinarily stubborn materials scientist who had built a weapon out of mathematics and desperation and the specific conviction that the universe did not require you to lose just because the numbers said you should. She thought about Kovacs sitting in the dark of the Unwavering for 6 weeks, running calculations, waiting for her signal, trusting a plan that required the enemy to be exactly as arrogant as they were. She thought about the TCA Council's surrender offer, transmitted to the Varek in perfect sincerity, because it had been sincere. The Council genuinely believed they were doing the necessary thing, and how that surrender offer had in Kovacs' plan been load-bearing. Because a sincere surrender, from a government that genuinely didn't know about the Dark Fleet, would read as sincere to an adversary sophisticated enough to detect deception. The Council hadn't known. Yeva had known. Kovacs had known. A handful of officers and engineers and scientists had known. Everyone else, the council, the diplomats, the frightened political bodies that had fractured in the face of crisis, had been, without knowing it, the most important part of the deception. Their fear had been real. Their division had been real. Their inadequacy had been real. And all of it had been true. And all of it had been used, not exploited, but used, the way a river uses the landscape, flowing through what is actually there rather than what should theoretically be there. The last colonist off the transport shuttle was a girl of about 8 years old, holding the hand of a woman who was presumably her mother, looking around at the gray-green world of Callum's Rest with an expression of complete familiarity, as though she had never doubted she would come back to it, as though the idea that this place could be taken from her was simply not something her experience had prepared her to believe. Yeva watched her and thought that this was perhaps the most precisely accurate description of what had just happened, not in the tactical sense, not in the strategic sense, but in the sense that mattered after the tactics and the strategy were over, and the world was still there and people were standing on it. The Varek had arrived with 4,000 years of evidence that the universe was a system to be controlled, and that systems submitted to sufficient force, and that the categories they had assigned to every species they had ever encountered held, and they had been right about all of it, right up until the moment they were wrong, because they had never encountered a species that had grown up on a single difficult world with too many competing voices and too many hard lessons and the specific kind of imagination that comes from being small and fragile and choosing, in defiance of every rational calculation, to stay. In the years that followed, other species in the galactic community, the Helathi, the Morn Collective, the Pendant Systems, those dozens of civilizations that had watched the Varek's expansion, with the resigned acceptance of those who had concluded that resistance was a category error, received, through the standard communication channels, a translation of the Terran Cooperative Authority's post-battle transmission to the Varek Dominion. The one with the word hope in it. The one that offered partnership. Most of them read it more than once. Some of them reportedly read it quite a few times. There was something in it that resisted full comprehension on first contact, like a piece of mathematics that your mind kept returning to because you weren't quite sure you'd understood it correctly. It wasn't the content exactly. The content was simple enough. It was something underneath the content, some quality of the document that seemed to say without saying that the civilization that had produced it had decided something about the nature of the universe that most civilizations, by the time they reached space, had already accepted was untrue. It had decided that the story wasn't over yet, that there was always another move, that the numbers were never the whole calculation, that a species which had spent hundreds of thousands of years surviving ice ages and plagues and the spectacular violence of its own internal divisions had developed, not in its technology but in its bones, an understanding of long games that older and more elegant civilizations had never needed to learn, because they had never needed to survive the specific education of being born into a universe that was trying to kill you, and deciding, generation after generation, in the face of every reasonable argument to the contrary, that this was not a sufficient reason to stop. The Varek did not invade again. They did not, in the formal sense, apologize. Apology was not a category in the Dominion's diplomatic vocabulary, but they acknowledged, in a document that Sareth personally filed with the Dominion's Central Archives, that the human assessment of Category 3 emergent species required revision, and that humanity should be reclassified. They did not specify a new category. The existing category system did not contain a designation for what humanity had demonstrated. They left it blank. A blank space in the most meticulous archives in the galaxy. Somewhere in the archive's vast silence, that blank space said more than 4,000 years of documentation.